Sorry, I'm still a bit jet lagged, so I hope this is coherent. Okay, let me see if this works. Great, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about guilds or guild crafting and how that relates with some of my practice that the stuff I'm actually working on under Newtype. Sorry, let me put this down. Okay. So first, I'd like to talk about the origins of life. I don't know how many of you have heard of this model of the origin of life by Dr. Bruce Damer. It was published in Scientific American, I think maybe 3 years ago. And I mean, I'm not going to bore you with the biology of it, or the chemistry specifically, but essentially what he came up with was a model that said that for life to come about, the central question that needed to be solved was how does it self-replicate? Because if you think about how human beings make things, we make a bigger machine to replicate smaller ones, right? A car factory is a huge structure to make cars come out. But with human beings, or life in general, it tends to be something that self-replicates. DNA is really small, but it can make all kinds of things. All the living beings we have are made from this one substance. So the question that had to be asked was, how does a self-replicating machine evolve, right? So we start off with probability. That means that you need to have a space for things to be able to interact, to even start to interact in the first place. So that means you need some kind of stable environment. And then you need them to interact. So there has to be an interaction network or a framework for that interaction, so rules. And then once the interactions have happened and you get some kind of stable thing going on, you end up with a memory system that has to be able to keep what the product of the interaction was. It needs to come out here. And then that goes back into the cycle. So this is how creation happens, right? This is creativity. And creativity is what we're here about. This is how most things work. It's why cities are where a lot of innovation happens, because a city provides the opportunity for a lot of probability. That's a lot of people can meet in a city. The interaction networks, the roads, the public transportation, the universities, the academies, the cafes, these are all the interaction networks. And the memory systems, we have books, we have TV, we have conferences like this, and that allows the cycle to continue. And so we come up with new things all the time. This is emergence, it's also evolution. And it's something that happens intelligently, but without like a conscious direction or a conscious, would I say, it's not directed, it happens on its own. But this has created a lot of diversity. It has created the life we're in right now, right? In order for us to be able to continue to push that kind of diversity in our own existence right now, I would argue that we now need to decolonize first. I would argue that even though our society overall, I think, has become a lot more diverse, multiracial. People are living in a lot of cities. There's a lot of immigration. There are lots of people from all over the world living together now. We are arguably kind of all living the same thing, right? Last night I went out to go we went foraging, where's Stefano? We went foraging looking for traditional Filipino cuisine, and we ended up walking past H&Ms and Nikes and so on. And it's the same in every city in the world, right? What happened to the diversity? That's gone, right? This is something that happens as a process of colonization. Now, not necessarily about colonization of a country coming and taking over another country, but there's such a thing as a colonial mindset. And that is something that has happened to all of us. And it's a shame that as massive as the world is, that most of all our cultural influence is coming from a very small, relatively small section of that planet, right? It's coming from Europe, it's coming from America. Most of the massive companies on the planet are American. All our content is created there. We take it for granted. A lot of these things are invisible, right? I'm from here, and I would argue that our influence on the planet is almost negligible at this point in terms of the global conversation. But diversity is important. Oops, sorry, let me not distract you with that first. Let me talk about this first. So diversity is important. Why is it important? It's important because it gives us resilience, it gives us anti-fragility. If everybody's doing the same thing, what happens when the environment changes? If everybody specializes in doing one thing and something happens to the rest of the environment that we're doing that one thing in, it becomes, you can't work in it anymore. It's like we talk about industrial wastelands where there was maybe a city and everybody there worked in a factory. All of a sudden, nobody needs a product of that factory, right? What happens to all those people? They go out of work. The economy tanks and the whole place becomes very moribund. But if different people were doing different things in that city and the product of the factory was to go out of style or no one wanted to buy it anymore, people would still have options, right? And I think especially now, with climate change and all these issues that we're facing, we need diversity because we cannot all put our eggs in one basket. Just one basket of like, this is the way things are supposed to work. We need to escape that. Craft is an ecology, so an ecology of place. I think these are very self-evident. It's an ecology of place, it's an ecology of time, materials, people, needs, and wants. Craft is almost like a map of a place and a people, right? It shows you what they're thinking about, what they had available to them, the kinds of things that they wanted to be able to do, what they believed in. So craft is a wisdom ecology. Now, what's a wisdom ecology versus just an ecology or an information ecology? Nowadays, I'm sure we've all heard of the term information economy, information ecology. And I would say that wisdom ecologies are something that indigenously we were all our various cultures, everybody sat here. Our cultures were involved in figuring out wisdom, right? Wisdom is very difficult to pin down. It's not something that you can explain just rote and say that, yes, wisdom is the same everywhere. If we look at ancient Hindu religion, for example, you talk about yoga, you talk about Ayurvedic practices and so on. They were all looking for something. You talk about ancient Greeks, they were looking for something. You go to ancient Yoruba culture in Nigeria, and you look at them with Odu Ifa, they were looking for something. The ancient Chinese with the Tao and I Ching, they were looking for something. What was this thing, right? It was wisdom, it was an insight. But in modern society, what are we looking for? We want wisdom, right? But our societies are not structured to do that. They're structured to make profit, they're structured to increase productivity, they're structured to extract better resources from the ground. That's what they're built around. But we're not looking for wisdom anymore. So I'm talking about guilds today. And here's where I want to say that guilds are maintainers of craft. Because if craft is a wisdom ecology, then we need to be able to build craft and maintain it and make sure that it remains in use. So let's come back to my diagram, my little chart. So what I would say is that guilds can perform both the memory function and the interaction function on this chart. Remember, probabilities at the top. So with a guild forming this, the creation that we're talking about now, that is this output of this system constantly just cycling, in this sense would be craft, okay, in this particular context. Because the beauty of this system and why I like it so much is that it's also a fractal thing. It happens across multiple scales. It happens in our cells, in our bodies, it happens in our societies, and it happens in the cosmos writ large. And craft is one output of this system. So we need to maintain those things. We need to create memory for them. But guilds must be redefined for the 21st century. Now, when I use the word guild, I'm not speaking, I think the first thing that comes into most people's minds is a medieval guild, some kind of leather crafting guild or woodworking guild, a Saxon guild. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that maybe evokes that, retrieves some of that thinking. Now, why do I say guild? Oops, sorry. So why do I say guild and not just like a corporation, an organization, an institution? I like what guilds represented when they existed. A guild was a very fundamental part of the society that it was in. They didn't just teach people skills, they also provided a sense of belonging and identity. You were a member of a guild. People knew you were a member of that guild. There were initiation ceremonies. There was a whole thing that had to do with your social life that went into a guild. Nowadays, we don't really have much of that in modern society. I can speak for Nigeria. In the case of Nigeria, you are born, you go to nursery school, you go to primary school, you go to secondary school, you go to university, you graduate, you get a job, you get married maybe you have kids, you die. That's it. Your belonging maybe is your family, right? If you're lucky and you're from a family with a name, then you have an identity, and that identity can shape some of how you go about in the world. But most people in Nigeria are not from families with names. We are maybe like 180 million people. How many of those people could possibly be from a family with a legacy or something? So where do you get your identity from? Usually you would say you get it from your country, like a national identity, you know. But in Nigeria, with over 300 ethnic groups and a lot of bad blood between a lot of them, it's very difficult to form a cohesive identity around a nation state, right? So a lot of people actually lack identity, and it's one of the things that's a very key psychological component for human beings. We need identity. We need a sense of belonging. We need roots. When you don't have that, it makes you very, I don't want to use the word dangerous, but it makes you feel like you are in danger, right? Like anything could happen to you. And so it puts you in a very particular state of mind. And it's one of the problems that I would argue we have in Nigeria. Our people just don't, because there's no identity, our people cannot even think about the future. They can't even imagine it. So I'm looking at guilds as something that we can redefine and use to be able to start creating a sense of identity. But this is not the solution. This is not about solutions. This is about one facet of something that could fit into a larger system. So, guilds, we have to think about what they mean and how they fit into the Capitalocene. So, here I am, I'm running away from the term Anthropocene, and I want to be very specific here, because the Capitalocene is important. We talk about Anthropocene as man-created change. This is an age that has done this. But to be honest, it's not just about humanity, it's not just about man. Most of the changes that we're talking about that have caused climate change, that have made this a geological era, are actually changes that happened in the last 200 years. And it's because of capitalistic practices, of industrial extraction, of externalization of waste, things like this, global trade. So it's important that I think to name this kind of thing. And this creates some things you always have to think about. You have to think about markets. Amne spoke earlier about being able to push product out. You need to be able to think about how do you sell? How do you market to somebody? How do you make it desirable? These are all questions that maybe 500 years ago you were not thinking about. You were thinking, yeah, I want people to like this, but you're not thinking about markets and global things, right? So the first thing that I'm looking at is the guild needs to be able to redefine craft work for the everyday. And what I mean by the everyday is a lot of the time when we think about craft, it's this unique object that you buy, almost like a gift or a token kind of thing. It's not something that you use regularly, right? Or maybe you buy it for a very specialist use. So you may buy a craft throw rug, and you throw it over a couch or something, and that's fine. But you're not going to buy like a craft tray to carry your bowls to serve people, right? Unless you're really specifically, you're one of those kinds of people that want something that is like that. Most people are not looking for that. Most people are looking for very cheap, very easy, very accessible. That's what they want. So craft needs to start looking at that, because craft used to answer the everyday of the societies they were in before. That was the only option. But now it's been displaced by industrial production. So how does craft fit back into that? How do you get people to want to use these things in their daily lives, as opposed to something that they just pick up every now and then? So the guild needs to be able to do that. The guild also needs to be able to provide survival and relevance to its members. How do you feed your family? How do you feed yourself? How do you stay healthy if you fall sick? How do you transport yourself and move around? How do you buy books? How do you educate yourself? How do you remain relevant in your society? You want people to be able to look at you with respect. You don't want them to think you're just a crafts person, you know? And then your family is ashamed that you did not go and become a lawyer. The Guild also needs to be able to maintain craft as a delicate form of activism. Now, I'm paraphrasing, I'm taking this phrase, delicate activism, from a pamphlet, which I recommend everybody reads. I had nothing to do with it, but it's an amazing write-up, I think, an amazing essay. And it talks about one of the key things that I think everybody here at some point should have thought about, which is that activism overall tends to, when you really look at it critically and you zoom out a bit, you realize that revolutions, in fact, it's in the name. A revolution tends to go back, it tends to go round, right? So you have maybe some people come in, they're revolutionaries, and they kick out an oppressive government. It doesn't take too long before they become the new oppressive government, right? It's the same thing with activism. Somehow, we always end up right back where we started. And that's because there's some fundamental things that you become so passionate about your activism. You're so, it's like, we have a problem now, we have to fix things now. It makes you become very self-righteous. It makes you become very aggressive. It makes you become very, like things are urgent, you know? And in that urgency, you also, the word maybe arrogant is not what I should use, but you start believing that you have an agency to change these things and to effect these things. You believe that you even have a responsibility to do so, right? And the truth is, sorry, I'm so sorry, I can't remember his name. The artist who presented the film earlier, Kidlat? Kidlat, there we go. He said something that I thought was it was very profound to me, which is that the future comes on its own. It doesn't need us to come. And I think it's one of the things that we need to do as people, and I think everybody gathered here is interested in making change, is interested in sort of fixing things, providing solutions, figuring out the way. But like that diagram I showed in the beginning, that process is always happening. It happens regardless of whether you know it's happening. It happens regardless of whether you are aware of it, right? All our intelligence allows us to do is participate in it knowingly. But it's a very humble position to be in. So it means that a guild is not coming out there to say, oh, we want to use craft as a force of change. A guild is there primarily to just keep craft going. It's a very different kind of dynamic. Finally, I also believe that guilds are also very much linked with rural futures. A lot of the talk seems to have been about urban areas, urban migration, people moving away from rural areas to urban centers. We're going to have how many million people in urban areas by the year 2050 and so on. So there's a lot of talk about how cities should look, how cities should run, urban farming, etc. But there isn't much conversation about rural areas. I saw recently that Rem Koolhaas was talking about rural environments being the future, and I'm like, well, you know, you caused this city drive in the first place, but it's fine. I think we need to really think about what rural centers look like, what their futures look like, how do they fit into the grander scheme of things. And I think guilds can provide this, because a guild fundamentally is also something that requires community, and it's very difficult to have community in urban centers, isn't it? There are too many people, too many things pulling for your attention. But in a rural area, it's smaller, it's quieter, you can actually build these kinds of things. And you can also provide an avenue for craftspeople to be able to send things out to the urban centers. Oh, wow, I forgot to remove this slide. Okay, well, I'll talk a little bit about why this is here. It's this is the chief of my village. I was going to do a whole spiel about how our village is actually primarily, we produce salt, and how no one is buying salt from this place. So it's literally just piling up in caves. But never mind, we'll skip that. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. So what does a guild now look like? I think a guild in this day and age needs to be open, not closed. Older guilds used to be very secretive. They used to hide their information. They didn't share it. It was about what they could do that no one else could do. But I think we can't think like that anymore. Buckminster Fuller coined the term Spaceship Earth. I think we need to start thinking like that. We're all partners on a planet that is moving through space. Just like a crew, you don't hide information. You're constantly sharing it so that everybody can pilot this properly. Guilds need to be globally aware, but locally focused. I think Malcolm Ferris used the term cosmolocalism. I really like that because they use cosmos in it. But yes, they need to be like this because you need to know what's going on outside, but you need to always be aware about your context. They also need to be planet-centric, not human-centric. Now, I say this specifically because I think the temptation is always that we want to design for ourselves and we only consider ourselves. But we exist on a planet with lots of other creatures that are also here and also came about through no efforts of their own, just like us. We just showed up here. And we need to be very aware of that because not only are we our own production and manufacturing affecting the rest of the planet as we can see now, and now we're struggling to grow plant a whole bunch of trees to try and make up for our own problems. The trees didn't ask for this, right? We need to always design this way. We can't plan otherwise. So any guild in the 21st century needs to be thinking about this. Guilds nowadays need to propagate sovereignty. Now, I'm using sovereignty in the sense there's a thinker, his name is Jordan Hall, if you're interested in looking him up. And he coined this term sovereignty. And sovereignty is primarily about three things. The first one is you need access to information to be sovereign. If you don't have access to information, you can't do number two, which is to be able to make decisions based on that information. And when you've made a decision based on information, you now need the ability, the third thing, which is you need the ability to put that decision into practice, right, and take action on it. And a lot of people are not sovereign. A lot of us here, for example, have access to information. We even have access to, we even know how to make decisions based on that information. But we may not have the tools or the money or the resources to be able to put that into action, right? It's one thing to be said, and you need all three to be happening at the same time for you to be sovereign. You can look at, to be honest, humanity as a whole, and this is also another fractal concept. Humanity as a whole is not sovereign, and that's because we have a lot of access to information, but we don't know how, we don't even know what it means, and we can't use it. But we have the ability to take a lot of action. In fact, more so than at any other point in history. So we're not sovereign. And it's a very dangerous thing when you have very powerful people who are not sovereign. But sovereignty is for everybody. So inherent in this, it means that a guild needs to be able to empower people who are not sovereign. So if you're you're a woman, for instance, in a place like Pakistan, a guild needs to be able to make you sovereign. If you are a child who doesn't have rights and you're in a guild, maybe you're young, you're 13, 14, you're learning a skill, it needs to be able to make you sovereign. You don't have money, a guild needs to be able to make you sovereign. A guild needs to be a maintainer of the commons. Now this goes hand in hand in the first step where I talked about guilds being open, but it means that a guild needs to be able to maintain this, the knowledge that is of a people and being able to make sure that people have access to it. A commons is not necessarily just about free information. It's about information whose access is controlled by a shared agreement, right? So guilds need to be able to come up with those agreements and update them as necessary. Guilds are also maintainers of the creative engine. That's the first one I showed you, the PIM machine. Guilds need to be able to make sure that continues to happen. They're also not homogeneous, and that's because they're context dependent. So each guild is going to be different. What I'm proposing here is not a solution. It's not a step-by-step thing of creating something. I'm trying to hopefully give ideas for a proposal for something that could look different everywhere, right? Thank you.